We'll get started. So good evening. My name's Noah Rubin. Welcome to the 19th Lionel Gelber Prize Ceremony. Many thanks to all of you for coming here this evening. Tonight we're celebrating Sir Lawrence's win of the Lionel Gelber Prize for this year for his book, A Choice of Enemies, America Confronts the Middle East. So Sir Lawrence, congratulations. It's an extraordinarily well-written, researched, and informative book. It is deservedly the winner amongst a vast field of great writers. It's exactly the typical, or exactly the type of book that my great uncle Lionel Gelber would have really enjoyed, with its detailed, finer trappings of intricacies of foreign affairs and foreign policies. He would have loved it. My great uncle Lionel was deeply involved and interested in global affairs. I regularly listened to him as a child at the dinner table, listening to him talk about it. I think that he would be, if we just think about the title itself, A Choice of Enemies. I mean, just thinking about the title, A Choice of Enemies, it's just such a fantastic title in and of itself that could have just sparked great political debate at anyone's table, let alone my great uncle having fiery discussion with his brothers. The Lionel Gelber Foundation has been the vehicle for the prize, and it's a legacy to him, but it really enjoys the benefit of the oversight from, and I guess the polished management, you could say, of the Munk Center and the Foreign Policy magazine in Washington. Specifically, we can speak about Professor Janice Gross Stein here at the Munk Center, who's the director, and it's her vigor, her intelligence, and her devotion to the prize that really has, in large measure, moved this prize not from just a Canadian prize, but to a global prize, and we really need to thank her for that, so thank you. We also, I just would like to thank quickly two other individuals who worked quite diligently on the prize, and that is Nina Borick and Diana Crosby for their administrative and marketing efforts for the prize, respectively, so thank you very much. And albeit George Russell was not able to make it this evening, we would like to sort of mention the fact that it's a lot of work to be not only on the jury, but the jury chair, and so kudos to him for their efforts. Now, on behalf of the Lionel Gelber Prize Board, I would just like to call up Professor Janice Gross Stein to discuss the finalists of the Lionel Gelber Prize and, of course, the winner. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Noah, for those warm words. It really is wonderful that we have not only the nieces and some nephews-in-law, but we now have the grand nephew-in-law of Lionel Gelber with us to celebrate the prize. It's been a personal pleasure for me. I am not George Russell. He's a lot taller than I am and speaks in stentorian tones, which I do not. But he was delayed in Washington. He had hoped to be with us this evening. George chaired a really stellar jury this year, and the competition really was fierce. We had over 120 books that were submitted, so that's a fair amount of reading. They got winnowed. I haven't really told Sir Lawrence all these details yet. They got winnowed down to 25 really serious books. The jurors spent a considerable amount of time reading those 25. They kind of got to 12 and then had a consensus around 10. And then the really serious arguing started. And as usual, there was debates because there was a wonderful, wonderful collection of books. So let me just share with you some of the things that the jury said about these books. These books are all outside because the Lionel Gelber Prize really is about getting a great conversation going about really interesting books about world affairs. That certainly reflects what Lionel Gelber himself stood for. The first was Bill Emmett's book, Rivals: How the Power Struggle Between China, India, and Japan Will Shape Our Next Decade. Bill Emmett, for those of you who don't know, is a British journalist who writes for The Economist, so you may have had the opportunity to read what he's written. And this is a look out at the world, a look out at Asia, which I think, frankly, it's inconceivable that anyone in this room would not understand the enormous importance of Asia as we struggle to reshape the global economy. And this was really just a wonderful book full of nuance about the relationships between Japan, India, and China that are far more complex than we might think. I'm going alphabetically, but I'm skipping Friedman to come to Misha Glenny's book, McMafia. It's a great title, and what some of us might call a zippy read. It just carries you along as you go, and it's about the dark side of globalization, the deviant side of globalization, the drug networks, the criminal networks, the terror networks that are all enabled by the new connections that we have. It's really broken new ground. People have been talking about it, scholars have been talking about it, but Misha went and actually lived this, with some of these groups, I'd imagine some personal risk, and he draws a very finely etched portrait of the challenges to international governance and international stability that come out of these networks. Ahmed Rashid, who some of you will know, wrote a book called Descent into Chaos, the United States, and the Future of Nation Building. How prescient is this as a title? The Future of Nation Building in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. We have Brian Stewart here with us. It is not the most encouraging title, Brian, Descent into Chaos. But the book, in a sense, is sobering read when you walk through the history of how we got to where we are now in Afghanistan, some of the almost willful blindness of governments as they struggled with this issue, not only after 2001, but in the 90s, and how we are still struggling to make sense. I understand that President Obama read this book, as he has been engaged in a strategic review. So if that's a recommendation to any of you to read, that might be enticing. Fareed Zakaria is the fourth, who's written The Post-American World, looking at a world in which the United States is no longer the hegemon, shares power. Really the subtitle is, it's not on the cover, but it's The Rise of the Rest. It's not so much the decline of the West as it is the rise of the rest. So it actually connects to the themes in Bill Emmett's book. But it's actually an amazingly cheerful book, which is lovely. It's a nice book. It's a cheerful book about the underlying strengths that the United States will have if it understands the challenges of sharing power in a more diversified world. Now we come to the best one. And the jury was unanimous that A Choice of Enemies, America Confronts the Middle East, by Sir Lawrence Freedman, was the best book and deserving of the Gelber Prize this year. This is a book that ranges over 30 years of extraordinarily complex history as successive American governments. And every single president, it's quite remarkable, has struggled with the Middle East or the greater Middle East in one way or the other. It's never gone away for any administration. It's never retreated, in a sense, to the back pages of the newspaper. But what Professor Friedman argues is that there were choices along the way, and that governments had more freedom than one might think in the way they defined these challenges. And they decided who was an enemy and who wasn't. The writing is beautiful. It is not the first book that I've read by Lawrence Friedman. If you don't already know, he is one of the most distinguished military historians that we have anywhere in the world. But that really doesn't describe who he is. He is one of these all too rare people. He is thoroughly educated. How rare that is, increasingly. Literate in anthropology. We were talking about evolutionary biology, anthropology, and literature this morning in connection with a new project that he's working on. Deeply interested in the big questions, in how we think about strategy. What does strategy mean in the world in which we live? And how we respond to these challenges. He is Professor of War Studies at King's College in London since 1982. He was Vice Principal of King's College in 2003. And before he joined King's, he was at Nuffield College, Oxford, the Royal Institute of International Studies. He is a Fellow of the British Academy, and he was appointed official historian in the Falklands Campaign in 1997. Reading him is a great delight. As I said, the prose is lucid, sharp, but the thinking behind it is deep. So it's a great pleasure to introduce to you the winner of the 2009 Lionel Gelber Prize, Sir Lawrence Friedman.
Janice, thank you so much. It is a tremendous honor. I was delighted to be on the short list, even more delighted inevitably to win. Listening to Janice, I realize a choice of books can be even harder than a choice of enemies. It's a wonderful prize. It's got a tremendous reputation. And it's obviously delightful to see the Gelber family here. And I'm really pleased also to be in the Monk Centre. Under Janice's leadership, it's done tremendous things, dominated the news over the last few days. Indeed, I suspect before anybody else knew, the Chinese knew that I'd won this prize. So what I want to do this evening is, I don't want to reprise the main arguments in my book in this lecture, if only to deny you a reason not to buy it, but to use the opportunity to consider the most pressing current foreign policy dilemmas facing American policy makers in the Middle East, and in particular the question about what to do about Iran. But before that, I do want to make a few comments about what I am trying to do in the book. In the book, I seek to give historical context to current challenges by exploring their origins. It soon becomes apparent that Afghanistan, Iran, Palestine, and Iraq have all been causing problems in one form or another over the 3 decades covered in the book. So this context does not give rise to great optimism, but I'll do my best, despite all the odds, to end on at least a moderately upbeat note. There's been a constant search for a more stable regional order, and this remains unfulfilled. And one reason for this is that there are deep and pervasive divisions, Muslim, Christian, or Jew, Arab, Persian, Kurd, or Turk, Sunni or Shia, monarchy or republic, secular or Islamic, with or without substantial oil reserves, large or small, in territory or population. The lack of the sort of deep economic interconnections that helps pull the countries of Europe or of East Asia together means that there is an inadequate natural resistance to this tendency to fragmentation. Yet while the fragments have their own trajectories, they remain interconnected, and so often are neither separable nor containable. A chronic sense of vulnerability erodes trust, discourages a culture of tolerance and respect for rights, and undermines the capacity to develop and sustain long-term alliances and partnership. Oil gives the region its strategic importance and ensures that it receives constant attention, but it doesn't really tell the external powers what to do. So, for example, oil may help explain why the United States took a keen interest in Iraq, but not the various strategies that were then followed with this interest in mind. Washington followed almost every possible foreign policy stance available in its relations with Iraq, from appeasement to occupation, in the space of about 15 years. Oil does create a stake in the stability, and that can turn into at least accepting or even actively supporting the status quo. Yet it is a status quo with which, in many respects, the United States has been dissatisfied. As a matter of course, presidents have tended to explain the choices confronting America as between good and evil, democracy versus dictatorship, civilized moderates versus ruthless extremists. But when the hard choices come to be made, the options rarely appear so neat. This has led Americans, especially in recent years, into playing an occasionally radical role with consequences that have proved difficult to manage. The resultant disorientation is not unique to Americans. It's hard to think of any country, external or internal to the region, that has demonstrated a consistently sure political touch. Of course, the United States has made mistakes, but so has everyone else, including its adversaries. The Middle East is a graveyard of foreign policies. Sometimes the reasons for failure are obvious. As a historian, one looks back with a shake of the head and thinks, if only, or whatever were they thinking? On some occasions, the choices were clear-cut. The information was available to make them sensibly, and still the wrong choice was made. But as often as not, the implications of particular courses of action were murky. The immediate pressures to act in a particular way were compelling, and the benefits of resisting these pressures were fanciful and speculative. Political outcomes always depend on the interplay of policies, personalities, and circumstances. Doves or hawks, once they start thinking solely in broad categories about the human condition or dogmatic views about the nature of Middle Eastern politics, can soon find events uncomfortable and surprising. The lesson of history is not that with enough study a formula can be found that will guarantee success every time. The only real lesson seems to be that there are no lessons. It helps explain why all US presidents have found themselves pulled and torn by the Middle East. The policies that are apt to work best are those that work with the local political grain. Advice that was followed belatedly but successfully or partially successfully in Iraq. Washington is bound to find it difficult to get the countries of the region to act at all times as it would wish. It's an external power and not an indigenous movement. Its motives are always suspect, and it has a reputation for inconsistency and of a short attention span. Of course, it can't be ignored for positive as well as negative reasons. There's nobody else to turn to for serious support and potential mediation. But there'll always be limits to what it can demand and what it can achieve. But it is likely to achieve more with an accurate reading of local politics, a keen sense of history and social context, of loyalties and patterns of identity that are deep-rooted, of institutional structures, a rounded sense of the local actors and their preoccupations. But working with the local political grain is not straightforward. It sets limits on ambitions and requires often working with characters who would not in other circumstances be natural allies. If taken too far, it can appear cynical and at odds with national values. And as we have seen, when American governments deviate from these values, they also store up trouble. So the Middle East tends to push to the fore the inherent tension in foreign policy, which is not just an issue for the United States, between its realist and idealist impulses, between the need to stay true to core principles, while at the same time acknowledging the distinctive cultures, traditions, and political practices of those with whom you wish to engage, have to engage. This can be a real challenge for Washington, because within the United States, there is a continual cycle of elections, separation of powers, clamor of lobbies and the press. It hardly creates conditions for the nuanced and subtle foreign policy required to manage this tension. In order to inject a sense of urgency and moral clarity, there's always a temptation to simplify overseas issues, to turn them into good versus evil, as adversaries are shown to be irredeemably evil, while friends are exemplary and unusually deserving of support. All this inhibits dialogue with those castigated as unworthy and encourages excuses for the less attractive features of your own side. As a matter of practical politics, it's not so easy, however, to get a system energized to correct a power balance out of kilter, or to protect the vaguely disreputable from the unambiguously awful, or to explain why you're trying to start a conversation with people who were previously castigated as being beyond the pale. All of this is illustrated by the case of Iran. Up to the very moment in January 1979, just over 30 years ago, when the Shah left his country for the last time, ostensibly for a bit of rest and recuperation, Iran had been seen to be one of the two pillars of stability, along with Saudi Arabia, that would look after Western interests in a tumultuous region. The idea that the Shah was a Western puppet had been firmly entrenched in Iranian minds since the 1953 coup, which overthrew Prime Minister Mossadegh, an event which is at best dimly remembered in the West, but remains to the fore in Iranian consciousness. The Iranians also recall that the Shah's appetite for Western arms, which reached quite gluttonous proportions, was fed by eager Western governments and arms manufacturers, desperate to recycle the petrodollars that had been flowing into the Middle East following the massive price rises of 1974. From 1972 to 77, Iran's military budget jumped from 1.2 billion a year to 9.4 billion. During this period, with Iran assigned a crucial strategic role, and Iran still supposing that the Americans and British were the real powers behind the peacock throne, these countries had little grasp of what was actually going on and the social and political upheavals underway. On New Year's Eve 1978, President Carter described Iran under the Shah's great leadership as, quote, an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world. In fact, by this time, there were many signs of the decadence and discontent that were undermining the Shah's authority, or the little visible side of the cancer that was already eating away at his health, confidence, and assurance. The Shah had taken a dim view of any contact with opposition forces, so Western intelligence missed not only the hostility to the monarchy, but also the critical role being played by Islamists, led by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and using the networks created by mosques and religious schools to mobilize and spread the word. As the Shah floundered during the course of 1978, so did the Carter administration, only realizing too late that one of the fixtures of regional politics and the foundation of American strategy was about to be dislodged. Later, Carter was blamed for the collapse of the Shah's regime because he insisted on a human rights agenda that failed to take account of local political realities and the fragility of the monarchy. For those nervous about recent efforts to promote democracy in unpromising settings, this is Exhibit 1, set to demonstrate the dangers of insisting on Western values and practices without thinking through the likely consequences. In this case, this charge is overstated. The key moves were taken by the Shah in 76, before Carter was inaugurated. This was partly in anticipation of the new president's known human rights agenda, but also because the Shah was aware of the intensity of the backlash caused by the repression of previous years. The fact that some reforms were underway meant that, as president, Carter was largely satisfied with what the Shah was doing. The problem was that when the political system was opened up, especially with the assumption that the Shah was acceding to American demands, the opposition became emboldened. The Shah panicked. He reversed course and tried to clamp down, but his efforts backfired once again, and he began to lose control. If he had decided on total repression and military rule, a reluctant America would probably have supported him. But he dithered, and it was this dithering that was fatal to his rule. This was the start of a tumultuous year in international politics. After the Shah left his country for good in January 1979, came the Egypt-Israel peace treaty in March, Saddam Hussein making himself president of Iraq in July, armed religious fanatics taking over the Grand Mosque in Mecca in November, a month in which the American embassy in Tehran was also seized, and lastly, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December. I start with this period in my book because it strikes me as a transitional period in international affairs. At the time, all foreign policy was still viewed through a Cold War perspective. This conflict did not feel to be only a decade away from its finale. So while those issues of fragile states and radical Islamism that now preoccupy us were coming into view, policymakers of the time struggled to find a framework within which they could be addressed. Critically, up to this point, Islam as a political phenomenon was assumed to be moderately helpful in a Cold War context because it was so deeply opposed to atheistic communism. This is why it was so energetically supported at the same time in the fight against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. This was therefore a period of transition from one form of radicalism to another, what I call the first radical wave to the second radical wave. Egypt's treaty with Israel marked the end of the first wave, which had been set in motion by Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser in the early 50s, and was marked by secular, socialist, republican, anti-Zionist, nationalist pan-Arabism. Bolstered by the humiliation of Britain in the 1956 Suez Crisis and reinforced by coups in countries such as Syria, Iraq, and Libya, this was the ascendant ideology in the 1960s. But by the end of the 1970s, it was in decline. It had failed economically, it had failed militarily, notably against Israel in 1967. It had failed in its pan-Arabist aspirations as rivalries undermined every drive for unity. Anwar Sadat's move away from the Soviet Union to the US and his readiness to make peace with Israel confirmed the decline. The second radical wave of Islamism had been developing for some time. Its roots can be traced back to the Muslim Brotherhood, founded in Egypt during the interwar years. Those of the first radical wave always saw it as a threat, which is why the Brotherhood was so badly persecuted under Nasser. Sadat, as it turned out, and wisely for him, because it was the cause of his assassination, had given the Islamists more scope as a way of marginalizing the left. The Saudis always had a soft spot for an ideology that could protect and project religious faith, so long as the kingdom itself did not become a target. And of course, in 1979, they realized it could become a target too, so they moved to an even more stringent religious ideology. But what was not fully appreciated was the capacity of Islamism to pick up on populist social themes normally associated with the left. So what was striking about the Iranian Revolution was it brought together initially both radical waves, the leftists and the communists, who had borne the brunt of the Shah's repression, along with Islamists and Shiite clerics led by Khomeini. There were also some reassuring liberal nationalistic faces that provided the first ministers of the new regime. They were so soon pushed aside as power struggles developed between the leftists and the Islamists, which the Islamists won decisively using the hostage crisis with the Americans and the war with Iraq, which began in September 1980, to marginalize their opponents. I now want to, you're relieved to know, to fast forward to the start of 2002, skipping over the hostage crisis, the Iran-Contra affair, the dual containment of the 1990s and the 1996 bombing of the Khobar Towers housing complex in Saudi Arabia, for which Iran was undoubtedly responsible. I do, however, want to pause briefly in the late 1990s, because then there were tentative moves towards rapprochement after Mohammad Khatami was unexpectedly elected president in 1997 as a reformer. The Clinton administration did try to get things moving by acknowledging the grievances that Iran might have against the United States and offering talks without preconditions. Khatami would have liked to respond and spoke of a dialogue among civilizations. But he had trouble getting fellow reformers into key positions and never succeeded in getting any control over the security agencies. Critically, he took fright as the hardliners criticized his policies and harassed his fellow reformers. He refused to back his own supporters when they took to the streets. Power drained away. The American overtures were dismissed as promising respect, yet still criticizing the workings of the revolution. In the aftermath of September 11th, 2001, there was an opportunity to get some sort of dialogue going once more. when the Bush administration moved decisively against al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and the Taliban regime which gave it sanctuary, this was done with tacit, not so tacit Iranian support. The Iranians were also active and constructive participants in the effort to reconstruct Afghanistan after the overthrow of the regime. So why in January 2002 did President Bush name Iran as a member of the axis of evil? This was a real example of choosing enemies. The starting point for this speech was Iraq. The administration had decided in late 2001 that Saddam Hussein was next on the list. The rationale was that the most terrible prospect was for a group with the deadly ambition of al-Qaeda to gain access to weapons of mass destruction, and that Iraq was a likely source. Still, at the start of 2002, the administration was nervous about singling out Iraq, lest it appear that it had already decided upon war. It therefore decided to give Iraq some company. There was a degree of arbitrariness about the membership of this new club. North Korea was added without fuss, but others were more controversial. Syria and Libya, for example, were almost in, but then left out. Iran was a controversial inclusion, and it was not because of its nuclear program. It was known that Iran was engaged in nuclear research, but the full extent of its enrichment activities did not become apparent until much later in 2002, when an opposition group released details of the plant at Isfahan. There appear to have been two prompts. The first was a totally unfounded belief that Iran was on the verge of a counter-revolution against Islamist rule, and that a word from the United States might help just push it in that over the edge. The second was a discovery just before the speech of a boatload of arms from Iran destined for the Palestinians. This, at the time when the Second Intifada was at its height, was deeply damaging both for the Palestinian Authority and Iran. Even so, after the initially successful occupation of Iraq, with Saddam Hussein, an enemy the Iranians again shared with the Americans, with Saddam toppled, an American power apparently at its most formidable, the Iranians offered talks covering all issues between the two countries. The Americans showed absolutely no interest. From that point on, the Iranian position strengthened while that of the Americans worsened. The Americans got bogged down in long-term struggles in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Iranians were pleased to be able to stir these two pots to keep the Americans tied down, and so not able to move on to make them their next target for regime change. Friendly Shia parties moved into power in Iraq, while the two armed political movements that they support, Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Palestine, prospered, strengthening their social bases and proving difficult to dislodge, even in the face of Israeli onslaughts. Iran acquired all the ingredients of a major threat: a radical ideology married to a sense of past humiliations and growing strength, bolstered in this case, at least until recently, by oil revenues and the prospect of nuclear weapons. And it had form as a meddler in the affairs of its neighbors, an exporter of militants, money and weapons to hardline groups, accompanied by a virulent and divisive ideology. In its dealings with the wider international community, it has shown recklessness and a certain swagger. Yet it is also a country of only modest size and means, albeit in a strategically central position. In a straightforward war with the United States, there'd be no contest. If it is able to balance American power, it's not because of its military strength, but on its ability to disrupt the flow of oil out of the Gulf and to cause mayhem in neighboring countries. It is these considerations that have encouraged a cautious American approach when considering direct attacks on Iran. Even the Bush administration, which conspicuously maintained the military option, showed an underlying tentativeness. A multilateral approach was supported, along with active roles for international organizations such as the UN and the International Atomic Energy Authority. Diplomatic isolation and economic sanctions were pursued as the best forms of coercion, though neither caused Iran to veer away from a confrontational course. Whatever the internal debates in Tehran these sanctions caused, the hardliners stayed on top. Nonetheless, Iran may now not be quite so sure of its position. Its actions can be interpreted by reference not only to its ambition, but also to the insecurities resulting from instability around its borders, Israel's own nuclear capability, and the attitudes of Saudi Arabia as well as the United States. there is an energy case for nuclear capability, although not the enrichment technology currently being pursued. Perhaps the main objective is no more than to demonstrate the ability to reach a certain technical level rather than to push to the next stage of an actual military capability, which would be unambiguously provocative and create crises and possibly harsh responses from the Israelis, Saudis, and Americans, perhaps even Russia. As Iran has repeatedly said this is not its intention, it would have to change its story dramatically once it sought to develop a military capability. There are also different assessments of whether it is making as much progress as it claims. Still, it would be unwise to play down the Iranian intent or trivialize the significance of eventual success. Nor would there be reason for taking great comfort if Iran achieved a capability to produce the material for a nuclear weapon, but then refrained from full weaponization. Well, that probably remains the best that can be achieved by a diplomatic compromise. Why then might it be interested in a compromise? The main reason is that its economy is in a mess. Ahmadinejad's populist economic policies squandered oil wealth during the good times and have left nothing in reserve for the hard. Inflation is now 31% and rising. The government faces a $44 billion budget deficit and banks are out of money. The total population is around 70 million, but growing rapidly and very young. 1/4 of the population is under 15. So even when it manages economic growth of some 5% a year, this is insufficient to cope with the annual increase of almost 1 million youngsters onto the labour market. It suffers from corruption, poor regulation, unsustainable subsidies on fuel and food, high inflation and a chronic lack of investment, aggravated by sanctions. The collapse of the oil price has added to its predicament, cutting dramatically its major source of revenue. Is it ready to compromise? Iran's political structure is curious, with ultimate power resting with the country's spiritual rather than elected leader. The considerable elements of pluralism that the constitution permits are undermined, although by no means eliminated, by a clerical ability to veto candidates for office and set the terms for policy debates. There is sufficient here to give hope to those in the international community interested in diplomatic engagement, although at the same time, considerable scope for those Iranians determined to keep the revolutionary flame burning in ways that might thwart the efforts of reformers. And this means that while the coming Iranian elections are important and the fate of President Ahmadinejad will be watched carefully, real power rests with the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, and he is the one who will decide the terms of any engagement with the United States and the wider international community. It was Khamenei who gave the somewhat unpromising initial response to President Obama's more recent overture to Iran, although despite the harsh rhetoric, he didn't completely close the door. Like everybody else, the Iranians are still in the process of forming their judgments on the Obama presidency. In some respects, the American position in the Middle East is not as bad as it seemed likely that it might be a couple of years ago. Although the situation is still fragile, Iraq is no longer in a headlong rush to civil war, and the security situation has improved, and there is a schedule for American withdrawal. Obama himself remarked the other day how surprising it was to find himself remarking on the relatively calm nature of Iraqi policy. The second hopeful development, and this may be more controversial, is that al-Qaeda appears to have peaked. This is true both globally and in Iraq, where it once promised to acquire a base for both its Middle Eastern and European operations. Improved intelligence and protective measures have contributed to al-Qaeda's decline, but in many respects this reflects the natural tendency of radical movements to internecine strife, overreaching and relying on violence to settle their internal disputes as much as to achieve their ultimate goals. It is now being challenged from within the Islamic world because it is seen to have killed large numbers of Muslims to no evident benefit and on dubious theological grounds. Its failure to mount attacks during the recent Gaza war is an indication of the constraints under which it is now working. President Obama has dropped references to the war on terror, and in Britain we've now disowned the term. So this war not so much been won or lost, but it's sort of petered out. Now, there are three qualifications, what might seem to be an optimistic assessment here. First, strategic decline doesn't preclude tactical success. Some future terrorist outrage could gain al-Qaeda attention and boost the morale of its followers, even if they are now unable to turn this into an irresistible campaign. Second, what may be in decline is reliance on indiscriminate terror rather than the underlying Islamist ideology. And this remains a difficult ideology for Western countries to address. Unlike the confrontations with Nazism and communism, with which this is often compared, this creed was never intended for them. They must therefore accept Islamism as, in the first instance, a reflection of conflict within the Muslim world and rely on counter-tendencies developing within Islam. The attempt by the Bush administration to establish free market, human rights liberalism as a new radical project for the region unsurprisingly got nowhere. It was right to judge that supporting authoritarianism in the past had not produced the desired stability, but the desire to prod notionally friendly but authoritarian regimes into reform soon faded with growing anxiety about the dangers of actually inviting further instability. And this takes us back to the underlying problem in the Middle East of the Americans being committed to the security of countries with which, in many respects, it is not in sympathy. The third and most important qualification is that the real issue now is the complex interaction between the Afghan and Pakistan versions of the Taliban. This has unsettled both of these governments and threatens long-term instability in a way that al-Qaeda never could have done. This has become the main priority correctly of the new administration and has led to a commitment already of some 21,000 new troops to Afghanistan. Note this is about the same level as the surge in Iraq, although of course the political and security context is quite different. This illustrates more generally an important aspect of current trends. Where radical groups do well and develop durable bases for their operations, they tend to be well integrated locally, or at least with a formidable section of the population, as is the case with Hezbollah and Hamas. They gain their strength not so much as the expression of an absolutist ideology, as much as fighters in a long-term struggle with which people identify. But this also opens up to more familiar and manipulable political processes, but also reduces the value of routine denunciations for terrorism and extremism. The dire situation in what is now known as AfPak, combined with the demands of the economic crisis, makes it highly unlikely that the Obama administration will want to open up another front of confrontation over the coming months. It may be that the clock is ticking away in terms of the Iranian enrichment program, but there is no evidence that the administration is at all keen to bring this issue to a head. The president is now seeking a political settlement with Iran. It will be hard to get a further tightening of sanctions, let alone support for military strikes, until the president has conspicuously and reasonably tried to get such a settlement and has been equally conspicuously and unreasonably rebuffed. I'm doubtful that even in that situation, the military option will look at all attractive, given the likely turbulence in oil markets and regional instability that would follow airstrikes. It might be a price worth paying if there was confidence in what might be achieved, but at best the result would be delay. Plus, as a result of the experience, an even greater Iranian determination to get some sort of deterrent capability. Perhaps the Israelis will try some sort of unilateral action, and they are reported to have sought permission from the Bush administration and were denied it. But I suspect this was probably to encourage the Americans to think seriously about doing the deed themselves. And Obama is unlikely to be raising their hopes, while the strengthening of the Iranian air defenses, when and if the Russian system currently on order are delivered, will make it more difficult. There are precedents, attacks against Iraq's nuclear facilities in 1981 and Syria's in September 2007, but these operations were undertaken with surprise, against minimal opposition, and against single targets. This time the distances are long, the target set more complex, and the defenses more prepared. More seriously, Iran has retaliatory options right on Israel's borders. At any rate, for the moment, Obama has made it clear that he sees Iran as a test for the revival of diplomacy as an arm of foreign policy, accepting the need to explore the possibility of mutually acceptable deals with antagonistic countries and at least help ensure that conflicts do not escalate for want of proper communication. The Bush administration's approach of treating a conversation with the United States as a sort of prize for those who first abandoned their wicked ways is no longer credible. The only effect of that policy was to exaggerate the importance of diplomatic contacts while ensuring that the United States got the blame when no contact was made. There are nonetheless risks to giving diplomacy a more central role. In order to give the process credibility, concessions have to be found, which might just be pocketed without anything substantial being offered in return. Resolutions to long-standing disputes will not emerge spontaneously, but will have to be negotiated. And the deal-making could be drawn out and difficult when the interlocutors are unfamiliar and suspicious, and when there are doubts about whether any agreements will be honoured. The very fact of talking to unsavoury types will invite charges of appeasement and of conferring upon them an undeserved legitimacy. If it appears that the administration is only talking because all its other options are unappealing, then its negotiating hand will be correspondingly weakened. Yet in the case of Iran, I believe that it is still the right course. This is not because there will be an early deal, although the quieter conversations that have already begun on Iraq and Afghanistan might yield results, even when the nuclear negotiations remain deadlocked. It's a good idea, I think, because of the impact on Iranian politics. Bush's uncompromising stance made it easier for those in Tehran with no interest in engaging with the rest of the world. Moreover, it gave Ahmadinejad an opportunity to tease them. Certainly, he enjoyed the crisis far more than the West, and was generally the one to up the ante by making provocative announcements about nuclear progress. In addition to giving him an opportunity to show up the limits to American power and the ability of Tehran to stand alone and proud, an atmosphere of confrontation suited the hardliners, allowing them to mobilize nationalist sentiment. On the same basis, the hardliners fear more than anything else the warm embrace of the West, as this would require the country to open up economically, socially, and politically. If, however, an offer for them, the Americans, is crudely rejected at a time of deteriorating economic conditions, then it is the conservative leadership that will have to do the explaining. And they must accept the risk that a frustrated Obama may feel eventually he has no choice but to look again at the military option. Obama's new stance might complicate the Conservatives' position in the coming June elections, although, again, it must always be remembered that Khamenei can manipulate the choice of candidates offered to the electorate, and he will keep control of all security policies, including nuclear matters. Should a reformer win in June, this will still be significant, but given Khatami's experience, it would be unwise to herald it as the beginning of the new dawn. This is a long-term process. I suspect a nuclear deal is reachable on the basis of recognizing Iran's technical achievements, so long as they take them no further. They would be allowed a nuclear breakout capability in return for a verifiable promise not actually to break out. A much more problematic set of discussions will concern the Middle East and the role of Syria, Hezbollah, and Hamas. Now, the country who will be therefore most unhappiest with a long diplomatic game will be Israel, which feel its security is being eroded as the clock ticks on. And they've reason to feel anxious. They have hostile forces on their borders who are not satisfied with Israeli withdrawals from Lebanon and Gaza, and will not be, it seems, until there will be no more Israel. Once the Iranian-supplied rockets of Hezbollah and Hamas become more accurate and of longer range, then Israel starts to look seriously vulnerable, especially if they also start to be deployed from the West Bank. For the moment, Israel only has its demonstrated willingness to batter neighboring populations if rockets are launched from their midst as a deterrent to such attacks. But what it's not sorted out yet is its own diplomatic strategy. Benjamin Netanyahu's imminent premiership suggests a more hawkish stance on the matter of the United States, where there are now more doves to be found fluttering. But Netanyahu is as opportunistic as he is hawkish, understands American politics well, knows that his former neocon friends are out of favor, and has declared himself a partner for peace. Given the continuing disarray on the Palestinian side, he may judge this stance to be a low-risk option, and there is no prospect of talks going anywhere. But the question of the return of the Golan Heights to Syria, which was on the agenda when he was last in office, and on which much preparatory work has been done in recent months under Turkish mediation, may be harder to resist. The Americans have also started their own conversations with Syria. If the idea is to wean Syria away from Iran, there will probably be disappointment. But a breakthrough on the Golan Heights would start to reshape regional politics and once again open up other possibilities. The war in Gaza continues to act as a warning of the dangers of drift. The longer the conflict drags on, the greater the risk of a conflagration that cannot be contained. The wider international community is going to have to take a more proactive stance on this problem if it wants to draw the poison, and this effort will have to be led by the United States, not simply as is often supposed in terms of putting pressure on the Israelis to agree on a settlement, but to organize mechanisms to ensure implementation and to provide security guarantees. To get this far, with Israel offered recognition by the Arab world in return for settling once and for all its borders, will require remarkable diplomatic choreography and tough talking all round. Some of the deals will be a lot easier to implement if Iran does not actively try to prevent them taking root. So could this be part of some grand bargain that will reduce and restrain Iran's troublemaking capacity by addressing its insecurities and economic vulnerabilities? Well, we shouldn't get too far ahead of ourselves. My point is only that once serious diplomacy gets underway, unexpected opportunities may open up. For the moment, it's still true. It's hard not to be impressed by the sheer number of countries that will need to be engaged and the opportunities that always exist to disrupt political processes as soon as they appear to be moving in a positive direction. There will be a need to hold nerves during setbacks, talk candidly about the risks inherent in the compromises under consideration, as well as the risks of failing to seek any compromise at all. Obama should not underestimate the extra political capital generated in the Middle East, as elsewhere, by the mere fact of his election. But few parts of the world have been the recipients of more inspiring, more deeply felt, more incessant, but also more futile rhetoric. The track record of historians when trying to predict the future and offer serious advice is probably at best on par with astrologers. So the simplest thing is to assume the worst. One rarely goes wrong by taking a pessimistic view of the prospects for Middle Eastern peace. The pitfalls always seem more impressive than the possibilities. One can regret the weakness of local leaders, the abundance of spoilers on both sides, hostile to any deals, the underlying lack of trust, and the fact that the time never seems quite right. If the local parties are left to themselves, it's hard to see any discussions leading to definitive and durable agreements with any prospect of implementation. I did, however, promise at the start to summon up an optimistic conclusion. If there is a basis for any optimism, it's in the following three features of the current situation. First, there is a serious new president who speaks in whole sentences and has a capable foreign policy team. And he has decided to engage with these issues at the start of his presidency rather than at the end. Second, there is a degree of weariness in the region, born of excessive conflict and now combined with anxiety about economic prospects. Third and finally, there is a fluidity in the situation as a number of interesting possibilities for deals have opened up. A concluding passage in my book has often been quoted back at me, in which I suggest, quote, the continuity in many of the problems facing the Middle East suggests that they must be managed or endured. They are too rooted in the institutional structures, power balances, and cultures of the region to be solved. This has been described as being too fatalistic, but I didn't mean it that way. Very few international problems actually are truly solved. They move from one stage to another, stop deteriorating, stabilize, show modest improvement, sometimes get worse. There was the possibility of slipping back. So management is good. Management means that situations are more or less under control and aspects of normality can turn to life. Management is better than what we have now. Management does not preclude diplomatic deals that can transform aspects of the situation. The terminology just requires us to keep in mind that even if we can move some of these situations to a new and less threatening stage, they will still carry that potential for danger that will require our political leaders to pay close and continuous attention to this ever-challenging but vitally important part of the world. Thank you.
You can see why the book was wonderful. I've always said that anybody who works on the Middle East is a structural optimist because you can't continue to do it. I'm going to let Professor Freeman have a sip of water, and then we're going to take questions from the audience before we actually award the prize with the check to Professor Freeman. So if you would identify yourselves, we have a portable mic here. I'm going to start with my colleague Michael Maris, who's in the third row. Shreen, okay? Right there. Great.
Janice, how did... That's a good question. Sir Lawrence, let me ask you about an idea that has been put about by a high-profile Canadian politician and former justice minister that what the situation in the Middle East needs now is an indictment against President Ahmadinejad for incitement to genocide. This is an idea that has picked up remarkable steam from various quarters, and I wonder if you could give a non-lawyer's perspective on the matter.
I don't think these sort of indictments are that much about law. Of course, you might almost have continued the sentence in a different way, that there are people drawing up indictments against Israeli politicians for what happened in Gaza. And it is an issue in some potential I mean, it's more likely that an Israeli politician might find itself caught by some enthusiastic international lawyer than I suspect Ahmadinejad, who may be out of office in a number of months. Look, Ahmadinejad is a weird personal philosophy, at least to us, to me, as a Holocaust denier, and has said some outrageous things. He's not alone in the region. If you want to tot up the people who've said some of these things, who believe these things, there'd be no end to the indictments that we could be issuing. The real problem is why these things believed to the extent they can do, and is there a way of introducing counter-narratives into the region that start to challenge these, that start to realize how unacceptable and appalling these things are. I don't particularly think law is going to be the way that you're going to deal with that. I don't think the danger with this sort of thing is it becomes yet one of the many more gestures that knock around international politics. But and also there's just a problem with Ahmadinejad himself, in that because he is such an outrageous figure in many ways, it has led people to exaggerate his importance within the Iranian power structure. It remains the case that Khamenei is the key person. If Ahmadinejad goes in June and is replaced by a reformer, it's not altogether clear that an awful lot will change. He's embarrassed Iranians. His economic policies have been catastrophic, but he's not the cause of the source of the whole problem.
Paul Gaddario's next. He's next to Michael. Okay.
Sir Lawrence, I'd be interested in your thoughts about the role of development in dealing with the problems of the region, that clearly the choices that were made have a political dimension, but there were a lot of economic interests at play, and the solution to the stability, say, in Afghanistan and Pakistan depends on making the next elections about development rather than about the things they've traditionally been about.
No, I agree, and it is a shame. I mean, this part of the world performs terribly economically, despite the oil wealth around. It's sort of equivalent totally in sort of GDP to Spain. It's all the things that hold back economic development and growth are evident, from women's rights to political freedoms, even things like internet usage and so on. So there's a lot that could be done, and you can extend that obviously into Afghanistan, which is even further behind. And there is this sort of argument that if only you can get development moving, then maybe that would be a way for political progress. And so there's a lot of work that's been done by a variety of foundations with the Palestinians and so on, who are educated people. There's no obvious reason why they should be as wretched economically as they are. But I think, as with most of these arguments, you can't disentangle the security from the development. If you can get security, then maybe you can move things along. But it's going to be a challenge. And of course, the rise of Islamism doesn't help. It's not necessarily a development-friendly ideology. It doesn't encourage people to spend a lot of their education on the things that you might need for development. So, in principle, of course, you're right, and that's how it should go. Until I think there's movement on the political problems, we're not likely to see as much of it as we would like.
Brian Stewart in the second row, right here, this way. Yeah. We're giving Brian a free question. He had a formal interview this morning, but he gets a private question now.
Thanks. I just want again the degree at which things are not improving. At 30 years you look at, almost, as you say, nothing has actually improved. One after the other, the major events have not really improved. Everything has been tried, it seems, at times, yet still it falls apart. Is there anything feeling at all, in just maybe the last 3 or 4 years, that is changing? Or do you still think we're years away from really serious progress being made?
I mean, it is the case that each president seems to bequeath the same agenda to successor. And Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran are all up there. But things change, so it's maybe worse, maybe better. It's different, and things do move. Now, a lot of it, as you say, has not been a general trend to things getting better. In some respects, particularly the Palestinian issue, it's got a lot worse, and the Palestinian life has got a lot worse. So a lot of it is a question, not for resolution by outsiders, but for the attitudes within the region itself about what they want and where they see themselves going. And I think that this will vary. I suspect in Iran there would be considerable enthusiasm for a new start with the United States. I suspect this would get quite a lot of popular support, a lot of interest, and one might be surprised by the speed with which things can turn. I'm not as wholly pessimistic as others are about Afghanistan. I think I think we sometimes exaggerate the strength of the Taliban in Afghanistan. We're not in the same positions as the Russians were. So it varies across the piece. I don't think one should generalize. What you need is a conjunction of two things. You need the attitude that says enough, that we've really had enough of this. We know what the deal is on Arab-Israel. We've known it for years, what it looks like. We know what the difficult things have to be sorted out on East Jerusalem and rights of return and land divides and so on. The question is, how do you actually get to the situation where both sides have confidence that anything that's signed will be implemented? What is it that the external powers have to do to make that happen? Now, if you get this conjunction of a change in local attitudes and the readiness of external powers to help, then you could get movement. But that is, as Janice was indicating, a flimsy basis for optimism, but it's the only way you can see a way forward. All I say is if you did get movement, it could be quite quick. I mean, it's not difficult in terms of what needs to be done. It is difficult in getting to the stage where everybody feels that they can sign up to it.
That answer, I have a list, and you just have to catch my eye, and I know where you are, but that wonderful remark reminds me of a favorite story in the Middle East is, we see the light at the end of the tunnel, we just can't find the tunnel. That's, it seems to me, so next is Emmanuel Adler, who is about 2 rows behind where you were before, Shireen. Right there, yeah. Oh, sorry, then at the back, there's a question, the hand is up. Right at the back. Okay, sorry, I thought your hand was up.
Mr. Lawrence, I was wondering what your impression is of the silence of the international community on Kurdistan and the fledgling democracy that exists there, and why our Pearson policy is nowhere to be found in that neck of the woods.
I don't know what your Pearson policy is, so I'm going to get into trouble here. If we're talking, Kurdistan is Well, Kurdistan's an interesting issue because the Kurds are clearly one of those peoples who lost out after the First World War and have been losing out ever since. And the question of a Kurdistan manages to be threatening to a whole series of countries. Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Iran. And for that reason, Kurds have been at the receiving end of some pretty unpleasant repression, notably in Iraq. But it seems to me in Iraq they've played a rather clever game. I think they're aware that first they managed to get a semi-autonomous Kurdistan effectively, even under Saddam. And I think they're aware that if they pushed it too far, they will they will cause fissures and tensions. Where's the dividing line? Oil tends to straddle that dividing line. What impact will it have on Turkey, which has already shown its readiness to go into Iraq if it thought there was a risk of it? And meanwhile, the Kurds are doing quite well. They were the first really to get their economy moving within Iraq. So I don't think it's wholly gloomy for the Kurds. I don't think, on the other hand, that one can see all this gelling into a single Kurdistan. I just don't think that will happen. But the possibility of Kurds creating better conditions for themselves, I think, has been demonstrated in Iraq. And I think the Kurds themselves have played that rather effectively.
We have time for one last question right near Michael. There we go.
I'd like you to say something about Syria. There's a lot of speculation that it may be a key to some type of evolution in the area, and I wonder if you think it has the capacity to be useful.
Well, the last part of your question is the key one, because it is a capacity question with Syria. The assumption has been that young Assad isn't as tough as his daddy. This is another one of those examples of socialism in one family. And that is surrounded by leftovers from the regime, that it's based on a minority sect within Syria, and is nervous about its own security. And of course, I always find it ironic, given what's going on at the moment, that Hamas of the Muslim Brotherhood bases itself in Damascus, whereas the Syrians slaughtered, quite proudly, tens of thousands of members of the Muslim Brotherhood in '82 in Hama. So it epitomizes it. It's a legacy of the first wave of radicalism. Its ideology doesn't take it anywhere. Its economy is going nowhere. It is preoccupied with regime survival. So why is it suddenly playing more of a role? I think there are two reasons for this. First, there is the question of its relationship with Iran, which I think it has decided over the last few months that is a plus rather than a minus. That as Iran starts to be engaged with and is less treated as a pariah, then possibly its own role becomes more interesting as a way into Iran. And that's one interpretation of recent Damascus politics. Secondly, attention is being taken away from its role in Lebanon. Now, this hasn't gone away, and the indictments are still there, and it may come back. It was a particular preoccupation of the Bush administration, with good reason, but that seems to be less of a preoccupation at the moment. And then third, there is a considerable section of the Israeli establishment, particularly the military establishment, that would really like a deal with Syria. And a lot of work has been done on one. And if young Assad can get those sort of extra meters that Daddy Assad couldn't get from Netanyahu and Barak in the 1990s, then it would be hard for him to say this isn't a good deal. And this would be seen as an early win. I mean, one of the earlier things that could be done. Now, it's a controversial question within Israel still, as most of these things are, but it's not inconceivable. So Syria, for the moment, has found itself of more interest to other Arab regimes than in the past. But it's been there before and managed to blow it. So I wouldn't assume anything, but it is notable that Obama people have already started to make some contact. It's never been held as quiet. I mean, it turned up at Annapolis. It's never wanted to marginalize and isolate itself totally from the rest of the Arab world, though it has been treated gingerly because of its relationship with Iran. So, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. It may well be the lead in a surprising way if we do start to see some diplomatic breakthroughs.
I'm going to ask Noah Rubin to come up, please, and Sir Lawrence, so that we can formally present you with the prize. There is a real check that comes with this prize.
We have two things here for you. First is the check. And the second is his plaque. Very fancy. Which is the 2009 Lionel Gelber Prize. Your name on it. So congratulations again.
Thank you very much indeed.
On behalf of all of us, I want to thank Sir Lawrence Freedman for just an extraordinary treat tonight. You can, I think, feel and appreciate the mind that I talked about that ranges just with fluidity and fluency over one of the most demanding and complicated parts of the world. And he does so with intelligence, with ease, and with perspicacity. And he also stays optimistic. And it's not easy when you work on this part of the world. It is very interesting times right now. The pieces of the strategic landscape, I agree, are shifting. There is a greater sense of possibility. You learn in the Middle East never to make that leap, that because it's possible means it's likely. That's a very, very long sentence in this part of the world. But certainly there is a greater sense of what is possible and what is open now than there would have been a year ago. And it is going to be very, very interesting times as we watch this new president try to push that opening and make it larger. There can be no better book for you to read. If you think we are at interesting times, there can be no better book for you to read than A Choice of Enemies. I'm personally very grateful, Professor Friedman, because people ask me all the time, what's the one book, right? You get asked that question all the time. I don't have a lot of time, but I want to read one book about the Middle East. And now I have the one book. Just before inviting you all to the reception, I want to say a word of thanks again to the extraordinary Gelber family, which is arranged across the front row. The Gelber Prize is rooted in Toronto, but as Sir Lawrence said, is now worldwide in its reputation, which is a wonderful thing for Canada. But more than being a wonderful thing for Canadians and internationally, it's a wonderful thing for people who love books, because every year we get a serious discussion about the 5 most interesting books to read about global issues and about the world we live in. We get a pre-selected digest, and I encourage you all, as you're wending your way toward the wine and the food, to stop by all 5 books and feel that you've had your course in international politics for the year. Thank you all very much again, and please join us all for the reception.